I have heard Mike Munger, our speaker today, on more than one occasion say that Douglas North, his professor, always told him the answer to all questions is transactions costs. And we are not alone in participating in Adam Smith Week this year. One of the benefits of moving to this virtual environment is the transactions costs are low for other centers and organizations to join us. And so we are celebrating Adam Smith Week this year with 9 other centers and organizations who are either offering up speakers or providing sponsorship in some way, as well as trying to cast a very wide net. So we are looking forward to our stellar lineup this week. One of the main programs of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process is our Market Process Scholars Program, our mentoring program. And at this point, I want to introduce one of our Market Process Scholars, Eliza Quillen, who will introduce our first speaker today.
Hello, everybody. I'm Eliza Quillen, and I'm a senior in the Market Process Scholars Program in the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. Thank you so much for joining us today as we begin Adam Smith Week by hearing from Dr. Mike Munger. Mike Munger is a professor of economics and political science, former department chair of political science, and the director of the PPE certificate program at Duke University. His primary research focus is on the functioning of markets, regulation, and government institutions. Dr. Munger has co-authored and co-edited books with Melvin Hinich. He is also an independent author, his most recent publications being Is Capitalism Sustainable? And Tomorrow 3.0, Transaction Costs and the Sharing Economy. His current research interests include the problems of sustainability in capitalist systems and democracies. Previously, he has worked as a staff economist at the Federal Trade Commission, at Dartmouth College, at the University of Texas at Austin, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he was director of the Master of Public Administration program. He has won 3 university-wide teaching awards, the Howard Johnson Award, an NAACP Image Award for teaching about race, and admission to the Bass Society of Teaching Fellows. He is a past president of the Public Choice Society, an international academic society of political scientists and economists with members in 16 countries. He was North American editor of the journal Public Choice for 5 years and is now a co-editor of the Independent Review. He is the author of more than 80 scholarly articles. He has been published in the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, and the Journal of Politics, and has had books published with the Cambridge University Press and the University of Michigan Press. He also serves as an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute and as a member of the Academic Council of the Jack Miller Center. He writes for the Bleeding Heart Libertarians blog and the Learn Liberty blog. Munger ran as a Libertarian candidate for governor of North Carolina in 2008, and more recently, he ran for election to the North Carolina House of Representatives to represent District 34. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Munger.
So I'm going to talk today about, starting with my book, Is Capitalism Sustainable? And then I'm going to talk about platforms and some problems for policy. But I wanted to start out with a quote from Adam Smith, this being Adam Smith Week, and also because this quote is useful for my purposes. In book 1 of chapter 10, he famously says, "People of the same trade seldom meet together even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. It is impossible indeed to prevent such meetings by any law which either could be executed or would be consistent with liberty and justice." Now, if you stop there, it just sounds like, boy, this is something that we really need antitrust law for, because the conspiracy against the public or some contrivance to raise prices, that's the essence of monopolistic behavior. But Smith actually goes on to say the law cannot hinder people of the same trade. It ought to do nothing to facilitate such assemblies, much less to render them necessary. A regulation which obliges all of those in the same trade to enter their names and places of abode in a public register facilitates such assemblies. A regulation which enables those of the same trade to tax themselves to provide for their poor giving them a common interest to manage renders such assemblies necessary. So notice what he's saying is a very sophisticated, what we now think of as the transactions cost argument. And we were joking before that my dissertation advisor, Douglas North, thought the answer to all questions was transactions cost. But this is clearly a transactions cost argument because it says that maybe firms will try to coordinate their activities, but they're even more likely to coordinate their activities if the state does something to make them obliged to work together. And unfortunately, the state finds it useful to oblige members of an industry to work together very often when they regulate them. So a good public-spirited government official won't require meetings or trade associations. Now, those of you who have studied public choice, what is your reaction to me saying a good public-spirited official? Well, it's a unicorn, something that we can imagine but doesn't actually exist. So government officials aren't bad people, but they're no better than anyone else. And so, in fact, we can't defend capitalism. We can't do what Adam Smith is optimistically doing here by assuming a benevolent dictator. In a democratic state, you will always want to make such assemblies necessary. So Adam Smith diagnosed this problem in a way that I think until now has been underappreciated. And that is that antitrust policies are likely to make the problem worse, not better. So if you take away only one thing from what I'm going to talk about today, it's that we should at least be concerned about the possibility that self-interested government officials are likely to choose antitrust policy that make the problem of monopoly worse and not better. And Adam Smith had diagnosed this problem in book 1 of chapter 10. Now, I want to start, if you've studied markets, and particularly if you've studied markets from an optimistic or sympathetic perspective, you have come across a kind of version of this theorem. Now, I made up a word, voluntary, meaning what truly voluntary. So we can agree that the exchange really is between more or less equals who have enough bargaining power, they have enough resources, they can participate in the market. So if exchanges are voluntary, what do we know? We know that it makes both parties to the exchange better off. And if profits are the excess of revenue over costs in a market without artificial constraints. Well, what does that tell us? Often we think of profits as being problematic, but profits are actually a signal that the society should do more of that activity. Think what real honest profits mean if all exchanges are voluntary. It means that I went into input markets and I wrote voluntary contracts with owners of labor. I wrote voluntary contracts with owner of steel and plastic. I rented space and I rented electricity. I bought power so that I could use the power to put these things together. So I combined labor, capital, and input materials, all with voluntary contracts. Those all made the people I was negotiating with better off, or they wouldn't have agreed to the contract. Then I take the resulting product and I sell it in output markets. And again, each of those exchanges is voluntary. So every consumer who buys my product is better off. So all of the input suppliers are better off and consumers are better off. Now, profits are what's left over after I pay all of the voluntary contracts in the input markets, the revenue that results from the voluntary contracts in the output markets. If there's something left over, that's a sign that I am producing social value. So under those circumstances, this is the then part of the theorem, entrepreneurship is always virtuous. Usually economists are consequentialists. They say, well, it's good for society. I want to argue that the entrepreneurs themselves are virtuous, full-on Aristotelian virtuous. That is, they are cultivating the habit of the alert seeking of exchange opportunities embedded in a character of forbearance, of rent seeking. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what rent seeking is, but that's not really the main subject of my lecture. But rent seeking is the creation of artificial benefits or artificial barriers to outsiders that the state does to help industry or that helps individual firms in ways that have no part in helping consumers. So in the absence of rent seeking, honest profits are consistent with virtue for entrepreneurs. So that is the sort of textbook version of capitalism told from a market perspective. And what I want to argue is that even if we accept this as being the definition of capitalism, the creation of virtue by the pursuit of profits in voluntary input and output markets, using price as a signal of the opportunity cost of resources, even if all of those things is true, I want to claim that there's a problem that capitalism is not sustainable in a democracy. Capitalism is not sustainable in a democracy. Now, I've gotten some heat for this recently for saying, well, you're blaming capitalism for something that's the fault of the state. In fact, we all live in a mixed system. And if capitalism is not sustainable in a democracy, that ends up being a problem for those of us who advocate for capitalism, even if the problem is in some sense with democracy, because presumably we're all going to agree that we need democracy. The alternative is monarchy or authoritarianism. So that ship has sailed. We want to live in a democracy. What we need to do is try to decide what the rules are that are going to constrain the state. And so the question is capitalism sustainable in a state whose functions are difficult to restrain? Because that's the nature of constitutional public choice. So the problem of sustainability would come when we look at a market and we see that right now it's operating according to my theorem. So we go back up to my theorem, exchanges are voluntary, profits are the excess of revenue, and entrepreneurship is always virtuous. So we're operating in that system. But now the owner or manager of the company has a fiduciary duty. That means he signed a contract saying that he is going to try to improve the value of the company for stockholders. Now, it's likely to be true that the accounting profits of the company could be increased if the owner, if the manager, the hired manager of the company decides to pursue rent-seeking opportunities. He hires lobbyists instead of engineers. So the company for a while hires new engineers, new salespeople, they're making better and cheaper products. And as long as they continue to do that, they make profits and they produce value for the society. But at some point it becomes more valuable in the sense of increased accounting profits to pursue rent-seeking opportunity. And so I start to hire lobbyists and lawyers. Now, the difference is that when I start hiring lobbyists and lawyers to obtain favorable public policy or antitrust policy that actually just keeps out competitors and protects my position, my theorem is no longer true. It's no longer true that the profits that I am receiving in an accounting sense are a signal of social value being created. In fact, they may very well be a net transfer to me in excess of what I've earned and a sign that we are restricting innovation and the dynamism of an open market because I have obtained favorable tax regulation and entry barriers. So suppose that the manager is of good character and says, you know, this lobbying thing, I recognize that it's legal, but it's not moral. I refuse to hire lobbyists who are going to pursue rents, that is artificial gain from government. It is legal, I know that, but it's immoral. And so I refuse to do it. Well, what's likely to happen? There's a competitive market for managers. That's a feature of capitalism. It's not a feature of democracy. It's a feature of capitalism that there's a competitive market for managers. And it's quite likely that at least some stockholders, and maybe enough to push the question, some stockholders are going to demand that the company hire a manager who has the good sense and bad character to pursue rent-seeking opportunities through lobbying. And that would increase the stock price of the company, even though it reduces the social value of the company. But let's suppose that's not true. That is, let's suppose that the stockholders are like this manager of good character. They also say it's legal, but it's not moral. We are not going to pursue rent-seeking opportunities. Well, that means that their stock price is depressed compared to that same company that is pursuing rent-seeking. That means that a corporate raider someone from outside looks at that stock price and they says, you know, this stock price could be at least 20% higher than it is if they would just pursue favorable tax policy and rent-seeking opportunities from the government. So they go to a bank, they borrow money, and they say, I'm going to be able to pay this money back in 2 weeks because I'm going to use the money to make a tender offer for this stock. As soon as we acquire the company in an unfriendly takeover, we are going to fire all of the current management and then hire new management, which we will instruct to engage in lobbying. That will bring the stock price up by 20%. I'll be able to sell out and repay the loan. Now, again, there's nothing inconsistent or illegal about that. That is capitalism. I buy assets that are underperforming, and then I improve their performance. The problem is that the performance pursues the legal but immoral tack of rent seeking. So I can replace virtuous managers with rent seekers. That means that one or the other of those two causes is going to eliminate, is going to censor out any company that does not engage in rent seeking. And from an evolutionary perspective, it means that all surviving corporations are going to be focusing on rent seeking. If that's true, capitalism is not sustainable. Now, I could stop there because that's the basis of my argument, but I want to give some examples and to talk a little bit more about how current changes towards platforms are going to make this problem even worse. So let me talk about this from a public choice perspective. Let's just suppose that businesses maximize accounting profits, revenues minus expenditure. They actually don't care whether their action is moral or immoral. All they care about is maximizing their accounting profits. And if the state has policy for sale, it would be irrational for the business not to buy favorable policy. Now, you can argue that that's immoral, but it's not illegal, so a rational company would do it. And the reason that politicians might do that is that politicians seek to maximize power, including, but certainly not limited to, their reelection probabilities. And if they can get campaign contributions from large corporations because they sell favorable policy, then they can increase their reelection probabilities, unless they're punished for doing so by voters. But that brings us to 3. Voters are poorly organized and poorly informed. You can argue that they're rationally poorly informed because they can't have much of an impact on the outcome because of the collective action problem. But if those 3 things are true, those are pretty standard public choice assumptions. Taken together, they mean capitalism is unsustainable and it always converts to cronyism. So cronyism is the version of capitalism where at the margin, at least, almost all profits result from rent-seeking activities rather than the pursuit of honest profits. So this always reminds me, and those of you that are Star Wars fans, particularly Star Wars 4, 5, and 6, so the original ones. So Star Wars 4, A New Hope, you may remember that the drawing on the top left, that was what many people died to provide the plans to the Death Star. And you could imagine the conversation. We have this impregnable Death Star, which is going to be heavily armored and basically difficult to destroy, but should there be a thermal exhaust port that goes straight to the central reactor core? Sure, why not? So that was a plot twist that didn't make much sense. And of course, that's what it looked like, that hole that goes straight to the center. And remember, when they started trying to attack it, Grand Moff Tarkin got this news. The commander comes in and says, we've analyzed their attack, sir, and there is a danger. Should I have your ship standing by? And Governor Tarkin, what I would have said is, are you kidding me? There's a hole in the Death Star that goes all the way to the center? What sort of design is that? Instead, Governor Tarkin says, evacuate in our moment of triumph. I think you overestimate their chances. Well, of course, they were not overestimating their chances. They blew up the Death Star. The reason I went through that is that I think those of us who argue for capitalism need to admit that there is a hole that goes straight through our argument to the center of the reactor core, and that is capitalism is not sustainable in a democracy. Now, we're used to doing this and criticizing. I, at Duke, I have criticized many of my colleagues on the left for defending socialism. And when they do defend socialism, I say, look, to see that socialism doesn't work, all you have to do is look at Venezuela. But socialism is empty shells because you're trying to control prices. You can't ration with low prices. You're just going to have empty shelves. And what do my colleagues on the left say? They don't say, dang it, there's a hole that goes straight to the reactor core in the center. They say, oh, I think you overestimate their chances. That's not real socialism. That's a perversion of socialism. And so I say, if you look at all the countries that are actually socialist, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, all of them really are characterized by exactly these kinds of shortages. So that is in fact socialism. But then defenders of markets don't like it when that is turned on them. So this was an exchange on Medium in comments. In my opinion, the most important problem of capitalism that you didn't mention is lobbying. And their response was, oh, that's not capitalism, it's cronyism or corporatism. In fact, it's the opposite. So there was a commentary that Betsy DeVos was going to let one company handle all federal student loans, which was essentially a $1 trillion monopoly. And Norm Eisen on Twitter responded, come on, that's not capitalism. And Norm Ornstein said, that's crony capitalism. That's the opposite of real capitalism. Well, if my friends on the left have a vision of socialism, but socialism in fact always becomes Venezuela, that means that there is a problem. There's a hole that goes straight to the center of their Death Star. However, if capitalism always converts to crony capitalism because of the reasons that I've discussed, then there's no such thing as capitalism. It always reverts to cronyism. And so those of us that have criticized the left need to look to our own defenses. So the defense is always, that's capitalism. That's not capitalism, that's cronyism. So there is a danger. We've analyzed their defenses and their attack, and there is a danger. If cronyism is an essential feature in any democratic system that tries to be capitalist, remember, all we need to say is voters are passive and rationally uninformed, individual politicians benefit from cronyism, and individual corporate CEOs benefit from cronyism. So the only hope would be for one of these groups to act morally, putting aside their own self-interest, recognizing that cronyism is harmful to the system, but that would be virtue. And usually the argument in public choice is the one thing that we cannot assume is that people are acting virtuously. What matters is that the rules reward virtuous action. But if the rules in effect require non-virtuous action, then we cannot assume good people. So imagine that Grand Moff Greenspan gets bad news. So the commander comes in. I'm not very good at Photoshop, I'm sorry. Commander comes in, we've analyzed their attack, sir, and assuming altruistic CEOs is silly, while invoking a benevolent government violates basic public choice theory. Should we admit that capitalism is unsustainable? And Grand Moff Greenspan famously said, this was in 2009, this was called Greenspan's mea culpa. Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief. So what that meant was that Greenspan had expected the threat of bankruptcy and the value of reputation in a competitive environment would be sufficient to discipline the excesses of Wall Street firms. And in 2007, 2008, that turned out not to be true. The question is, should we admit that capitalism is unsustainable, or was there something unique about that? I want to argue that there is at least the potential that we are always on the road to cronyism. So F.A. Hayek rode the road to serfdom, saying that if we start to manage prices, we'll be on the way towards, we're not necessarily going to go, but we're on the way towards socialism. I would say that a capitalist system embedded in a democratic political system is always on the road to cronyism. Now, there's ways to turn around, there's ways to prevent it. It's not inevitable, but there is a tendency in capitalism, just like many people on the left say, for capitalism to devolve into cronyism. So let me distinguish profits, which are the excess of revenue from selling a product after costs are subtracted in voluntary markets. If that exchange is voluntary, each person buying the product must think she's better off. Entrepreneurs seek profits, and therefore they try to create value. Rent seeking is a competition for an artificial prize or benefit created either by taking money from taxpayers and giving it away, or a restriction on competition that allows an artificial increase in prices for products sold. Political entrepreneurs seek rents, and no value is created. In fact, usually value is dissipated. So the problem is that rational managers will invest in profits or rent seeking because they are rational. For that not to happen, they would have to be irrational. And if you want to start with an assumption of self-interested rationality, you have to deal with this objection. And notice that it's actually a marginality condition. It's the usual sort of calculus marginality condition. We will at first invest in engineers and inventors, and then lobbyists and rent-seeking specialists with personal connections to legislators and regulators, until the last dollar devoted to each produces an equal increment to accounting profits. So the only way capitalism can survive is if the last dollar devoted to honest profits is still more productive than the first dollar devoted to rent seeking. And so we're probably expecting this sort of marginality graph. The vertical axis is the marginal profitability of the company, and the horizontal axis is cumulative investment spending. So the marginal productivity of investment spending is falling beyond some point. I have it falling throughout, but for the relevant portion of this graph, it is falling. The more that we're investing at the margin, the less increase to profits we're expecting. So the horizontal line is the first dollar reward to lobbying. I'm not assuming that it's constant. I'm just saying that's the first dollar reward to lobbying. That's the amount of profits, accounting profits, that you get as an increment to hiring the first lobbyist. The only way pure capitalism is sustainable is if the curve is everywhere above that first dollar reward to lobbying. Capitalism is not sustainable and becomes at least a mixed system when the return to investment falls below the return to lobbying. And to figure out the actual equilibrium, we'd need a more complicated graph where we also would put the dynamic curve that is reward to lobbying over time. But I wanted to have something that was very simple. So the point is, early in a company's life, it is likely that they are mostly trying to compete with other companies, and they're scratching away trying to produce better products and increase market share and charge low prices. Over that part of their life cycle, they are likely producing a lot of social value. As a company matures, and this happened to Microsoft. Microsoft was quite a big company and didn't have any lobbyists. As Microsoft got larger and more mature, they now have almost an entire city block on K Street in Washington, D.C. And the reason is that it became much more profitable at the margin for them to lobby. Now, you can say that what Microsoft was lobbying against was they were lobbying against antitrust attempts to break them up. Okay, fair enough. But that still means that at some point, your investments switch from capitalism to cronyism. So there's an interesting extension of this about how it differs across nations. William Baumol, in a 1990 piece in the Journal of Political Economy, said that there are plenty of entrepreneurs everywhere. There may be some difference in entrepreneurs, so the total supply of entrepreneurs varies among society. The productive contribution of the society's entrepreneurial activities varies much more because of their allocation between productive activities such as innovation and largely unproductive activities such as rent seeking or organized crime. This allocation is heavily influenced by the relative payoff society offers to such activities. This implies that policy can influence the allocation of entrepreneurship more effectively than it can influence its supply. That last sentence is really important. There are plenty of entrepreneurs in the United States. The problem is that we are creating a setting where the rewards to entrepreneurship are greater from rent seeking, whether it be from some version of identity politics or pursuing green energy. But there's a bunch of tropes that you can use to increase the profitability of rent seeking. And increasing your profits by producing good products is becoming more and more difficult. So if you've been to Mexico City, if you have been to the coast of Spain, you'll see long sidewalks with people with blankets selling pencils and apples and little things that you can hardly think anybody could make a living from selling. Those are entrepreneurs. Those are people that are doing their best to sell high things that they bought low. So they buy these trinkets and they try to resell them. That's not a very productive activity. But entrepreneurship in those countries is largely foreclosed. That is, the social system prevents them from engaging in real entrepreneurship. The genius of the United States has long been that we reward real entrepreneurship, but that's fragile. It may not continue forever. So to sum up, capitalism is not sustainable in a democracy. The real argument for capitalism rests on two factors. The first is the creation of consumer surplus, signaled by accurate prices, rewarded by profits, and the rapid direction of liquid capital towards high value opportunities, signaled by accurate prices. So notice, accurate prices play in the important part, the moving part in both of those two. And I'm always surprised how few people know, if someone asks you, what is the argument for capitalism in one word? The answer is liquidity. Liquidity, liquidity, liquidity. Liquidity means that we have an immediate mobile strategic reserve to throw at important economic problems. And we can very quickly create a lot of value through voluntary transactions. Anything that interferes with that is going to mean that you have to engage in rent seeking. If you cannot attract liquidity, then you're going to have to engage in rent seeking by obtaining the permission of the state or the permission of some other actor that is in a position to hold you up. So there's a tendency to pursue higher accounting profits in the sense that revenues exceed costs by using coercive state power to manipulate those revenues and the costs. That means that you're going to try to influence price. The management of prices is the least cost way for large firms to earn higher accounting profits, but it's a disaster for the society. So there's going to be a conflict between capitalism, between free market capitalism and the interests of large firms because of that underlying statement. Large firms are going to find it to their benefit to be able to manage prices. And the best way to do that is to enlist the aid of the state. So a rational company is going to try to enlist the aid of the state, and a rational politician is going to offer the aid of the state. And voters are too unorganized to prevent it. So capitalism is not sustainable in a democracy. Now, my own view is that this is likely to get worse fast. And part of this is from a talk that I gave this past weekend in Savannah to the Public Choice Society. Platforms are systems that provide three functions. Triangulation, which means that you can find each other, and particularly in two-sided markets, finding each other is the entire key. Without Uber, it would be difficult for you to find someone who wants to get a ride or wants to sell a ride. Transfer is the actual delivery and payment for the service, and trust means that you can do it in a way where you will not be robbed and where you get accurate information. So in 2000 BCE, the souk in Sumer, the Sears catalog, the Fairfax Mall, Amazon, Wikipedia, online tool libraries, those are all examples of platforms. And the problems with platforms is that they create a setting where people can find each other to buy or sell or cooperate. What that means is that they are likely to have market power for people who are operating within that system. So if I have an account with Amazon, it is cheaper for me to go to Amazon and then get free delivery because I'm a member of Prime than to go somewhere else. And notice that Amazon doesn't actually sell stuff. Amazon sells reductions in transactions cost. I can go to Amazon and I can perform the first function. I can do triangulation. I can find things because they have a good search tool. Transfer, Amazon has created a credit system where they can help you with payment. They have a delivery network that they can do it faster and more cheaply than most of their competitors. And if you want to return it, you have in the box that you got, or you can print it out from the website, a free return label where you can just send it back. So transfer is much cheaper. And trust, since their return policy is pretty generous and it's backed up by Amazon, it's not just the company that you're buying from. Amazon is a self-contained platform for solving the problems of triangulation, transfer, and trust. I can engage in most of the transactions I need to just within Amazon. So as a result, these companies get big. The problem for antitrust policy is that platforms that are successful become giants. Well, giantism seems like a problem for antitrust. After all, the problem of monopoly is that they're able to raise price and restrict output. And as Adam Smith said, if you have some reason for doing that, you should just expect that companies are going to try to manipulate price. The difference is that platforms are becoming more and more important. So it used to be that Sears, the Sears catalog, for the most part, Sears would sell this stuff, but a lot of it was Sears products. Amazon, for the most part, doesn't make stuff. They make a little stuff, but they don't make very much stuff. So I'm interested in giants. I'm interested in the problem that is being created by giantism from platforms. So giants are economic entities that produce or contract for exclusive ownership of their own content, send out that content on a medium characterized by substantial scale network economies. There's two-sided markets where most participants are both content providers and consumers. They may be vertically integrated in the sense that they own some of their own servers, as Amazon does. Amazon Web Services actually owns quite a bit of web hosting. And they operate in a setting where the producing entities are few, meaning that the sort of Coase, Olson, Ostrom style solution of collective action and common pool problems become possible within the platform. So two platforms that are particularly dicey for antitrust policy are Twitter and Facebook. Now, what is it that Twitter sells? Twitter sells access to content that is created for free by other participants. And most days on Twitter, I am partly a consumer of content and partly a producer of content. So Twitter is just providing a platform where I can do that for free. Now, Twitter has a monopoly on Twitter. You can say you could start a different platform, but after all, the point of a platform is that we all want to be able to participate on the same stage. Facebook has the same problem or benefit, depending on your perspective. The advantage of Facebook is that we need a place where we can all go observe each other's cat videos. And I can easily find your cat videos and you can easily find my cat videos and we can comment on them. The problem is that it's obviously true that Facebook is going to have a monopoly on Facebook. Is there effective competition to Facebook? Well, once you have a platform, it starts to create economies of scale that produces giants. And some of that's going to come down to how you defend the industry. But it may be that until now, we have thought mostly in terms, antitrust, we have thought mostly in terms of consumer welfare. It may be, and there seem to be political pressures in this direction, it may be that we should start thinking more about power. And that's the thing that I want to propose as a conclusion for my talk, is that we may need to start thinking of integrated political economic systems like capitalism operating in a democracy, as the real difficulty being political power rather than economic monopoly. So the traditional mainstream media platforms were not two-sided markets. So the New York Times, CBS News, They were not two-sided. That is, they were the ones who were producing content and you were the consumer. But there were three functions that the mainstream media carried out that now we miss. The first was publication. There were restrictions on publication in the sense that in order to operate a television news station, you needed to have a lot of resources. In order to print a newspaper, the setup costs for a newspaper, even if you had the articles already written, the setup costs for the newspaper were enormous. The second is curation. Curation is the signal that this is important. The third was verification. That was the signal that this is true. So CBS News and the New York Times performed all three of these functions in, say, 1975. But after 1975, we start to get online, we start to get television cable, and the publication function was much cheaper. It was much easier now to participate in publication and to be able to have a voice, which meant that the curation function became fragmented. It used to be that things were important because Walter Cronkite told us they were important. The opportunity cost meant that every word that Walter Cronkite spent in the half hour allotted to him, minus commercials, meant that there was something else that he couldn't talk about. Now you have 24-hour news on millions of different channels. That means that curation is starting to go from this is important to clickbait. You'll never believe what happened next. Wait until you see what happened to her. So some form of clickbait replacing curation is a disaster. And verification may be in a way the most difficult. Now you could argue whether the mainstream media always told the truth, but there was some penalty in the sense that there was damage to their brand name. There is now almost no damage to failing verification. Curation actually is the most important. Since publication is free and there's no punishment for failure in verification, the main thing is eyeballs, clicks. And so clickbait titles have come to dominate where we used to have relatively small number of reasonably responsible participants. So the answer is almost always transactions cost. And the reason why we look to Facebook and Twitter, for example, the reason why we look to Facebook and Twitter to control this problem is suppose that an organization could control an entire institution. So Facebook has many participants. They have many people writing on Facebook, but they have some hope of controlling what people write. They can try to reproduce the curation and verification functions. But if you want to use the rules, what that is likely to do is preserve the existing distribution of power and privilege for itself. So Facebook is going to be primarily concerned about itself. So giants might be able to solve this problem if they were to be able to act in a cooperative way, but it's not clear that's going to happen. So this was an exchange between two people I happen to know, Zephyr Teachout, who for a long time was a member of the Duke Law School faculty. And she said, Facebook and Google want to keep playing three roles: essential infrastructure, publisher, and targeted ad mogul. That's impossible in a democracy. The government has to force them to choose a new business model, or rather, it has to choose for them. Ooh, that's pretty scary. So the government is going to choose a new business model for you, and we can rely on government to know how to do that. What's the right way to do that? Daphne Keller, a professor that I know at Stanford, wrote an immediate response to Zephyr Teachout. When you write about the internet as if it were only Facebook, Google, and Twitter, you help to create that version of the internet. So the reification goes like this. Journalists, academics, and other storytellers depict an internet with only those few companies. Lawmakers accept that framing. They pass laws that assume only the existence of the giants and the internet, and then work only for them. Those rules work only for them. The internet changes. So Daphne Keller is pointing out, if you look only at the large firms, you're going to see problems. If you choose solutions that are designed to solve the problems of the few large firms, even if you do have good solutions, it's not obvious that you will, but even if you do, the solutions that you're going to pick work only for those companies, and the restrictions that you see on the rest of the internet, the restrictions on permissionless innovation are going to be so vast that you're going to prevent the innovations that might have broken up the monopolies that you're worried about in the first place. Let me say that again. If you decide we need to regulate the internet in such a way as to control Facebook, Google, Amazon, and the other giants, then you're going to get a solution that perpetuates those giants. And so the difficulty that we have is it is unlikely we're going to be able to come up with antitrust regulation that would solve the problem in the first place. And there's a tendency towards giantism and cronyism that capitalism itself is contributing to the problem. So I want to argue that we need a reconception of antitrust that focuses on power, recognizing that there is a combination of political power that giants have, and that the economic power that giants have may just be used in service of that political power.